revised. We won't be following what I want. We're still on the seashore today, and today we're in Matthew 14, which is 22 through 33. And that was message, walking on the water. Walking on the water. Several of these sermons may sound a lot alike because Jesus did similar things more than once, but they're not the same thing. Okay? And, he sent the disciples across the Sea of Galilee more than one time. I'm glad you guys braved the weather today. I really didn't have as much trouble getting here today as I did when it was icy, actually. So, but don't ever take chances. Stay home if it's really bad. So. Okay, Matthew 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went on to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." Jesus had just fed 5,000, as it's called, although there were probably more there that day. And I think Jesus knew something that the disciples hadn't picked up on yet. Jesus was afraid that the crowd was going to force him to be king. And so he didn't want that to happen. So he sent the disciples on ahead, and he was going to send the crowd away himself. In John 6:15, which I think Jesus was talking about what was happening here, he says this, "So Jesus perceived that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king. He withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone." Jesus did that occasionally. He went to the mountain to pray. A lot of times it was before something major was going to happen. And I think that's the case here. This was going to be a very important lesson for the disciples to learn. And so he wanted to pray about them and pray for them, I think. We aren't told what his prayer was, what he prayed, but we do know he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And so he thought it was pretty important to get alone to be with God for whatever reason. And so, whenever you are thinking about something like that, maybe it's important that you go to God too, pray about it. This was a crucial point in Jesus' ministry and his teachings with the disciples, in hoping that they would develop faith in him. And he knew there was going to be a storm coming, I think. And so he was going to use that storm to test the disciples' faith. One commentator even said he thought that Jesus caused that storm so he could teach the disciples this lesson. That might be stretching it a bit, but that's possible. Verse 23 says that Jesus sent the people away, and he went up on the mountain then to pray. There's going to be storms in life. We can't avoid them. And sometimes the storms are a test for us. And how we react to those tests and those storms, I think, is pretty important. One of the kinds of storms that we will run into are storms of correction. It's a storm that comes that's there to hopefully correct our behavior, correct our attitudes, discipline us. You know, and so when a storm comes to you, you might think, well, is this a storm to try to correct my behavior? Is God sending this storm in my life so that I can get some discipline that I need? Good questions to ask. The other kind of storm that you may run into is a storm of perfection. Okay? So you've got the storm of correction, and you've got the storm of perfection. The storm of perfection that God sends to you, it's to help you to grow. It's to teach you things. It's there to expand your faith. That's the kind of storm the disciples were about to have here. Jesus prayed into the night. I don't know, we aren't told exactly what time he sent the people away after feeding them. I assume it's probably before it got dark. Okay? And so then it says he went up on the mountain to pray. So how long was he up there praying? Well, don't know for sure. But this fourth watch where he goes walking on the sea and the disciples in the boat see him, it was between 3 and 6 in the morning. And so, you know, if Jesus went up there when it was before, you know, as it was getting dark even, you know, just think it gets dark right now about 8 o'clock. So from 8 o'clock till 3 in the morning at least, you know, Jesus was praying for a long time by himself on that mountain. Have you ever stopped and prayed for that long period of time? That tells me something about Jesus, I think. And, you know, it can also be a lesson for us to learn that we probably don't spend near as much time praying as we ought to. You know, we'll have a 24-hour time of prayer, you know, or we'll have, you know, a 12-hour time of prayer, and we're not praying for that whole time. You know, somebody else takes over and we get done, whatever. But here Jesus is praying for this lengthy period of time. That tells me how much importance he thought prayer was, to pray that long of a time. And he didn't do it just this one time, that was all. We read in the scriptures where he did this many times throughout his 3.5 years of ministry. Well, the storm was getting pretty bad. By the time Jesus is walking on the water, going to the other side where the disciples were supposed to be going to, the wind was causing the boat to be battered so badly by the waves that the disciples were so afraid for their lives, it seems. And we're talking about experienced fishermen who had probably been used to storms like this, maybe. So this was maybe worse than what some of them had ever seen. They'd left in the boat, and out was dark. And they were rowing for all they were worth, but the waves were beating against them. And they were having all kinds of trouble. One commentary says that the disciples would have probably been about halfway across to the other side when the storm happened. God always picks the right time to have something happen to us. So we learn. You know, if they wouldn't have been very far from shore, they wouldn't have been out there in the middle. They would have probably been able to get to shore and been all right. They would have never concentrated on why the storm was happening. In other words, they would have probably been about 2 miles from shore either way, because where they would have crossed, it was about 4 miles from one side to the other. Now, think about this. Again, we don't know what time Jesus dismissed the people, went up on the mountain to pray, but he had sent the disciples even before that to go to the other side in the boat. Because the passage says he dismissed the disciples in the boat, told them to go to the other side, and then he dismisses the crowd. And only going 4 miles across the other side, they were only halfway And it was now at least 3 o'clock in the morning. They had been rowing all that time for the other side and not getting hardly anywhere. They must have been tired. They must have been frightened as the waves were battering the boat. And so when they see Jesus coming, they aren't thinking about Jesus. They're thinking about goblins and how bad the situation is, and they think it's a ghost. I don't know about you, but I probably would have thought the same thing. They need to be encouraged, and Jesus does that. Jesus knows what's happening in our lives. Now, I found this kind of interesting. Historians said that when this happened, there was a full moon. Again, that might have added to the scariness of this whole thing. I don't know. We aren't told, that it was raining cats and dogs or anything like that. It was just really windy, and the waves were that's the kind of storm it seems to have been, beating against the boat. So it could have been the moon, this full moon was shining and making it easy to see. But still, it was very scary. Out there in the middle of this Sea of Galilee, going to the other side in the dark, with the moon shining and the waves beating and all that. Jesus could see that. He knew what was happening. He knew the fear that the disciples had. And when Jesus saw them straining at the oars because of the wind, in Mark's account of this, Mark 6, verse 48, he mentions that they were straining so hard against the wind. That's when Jesus walked on the water. He waited until that point. They were halfway across. The waves were beating the boat. It was middle of the night, early morning. The full moon was out, and then Jesus was walking on this water. The waves were battering the boat. The lessons learned at feeding the 5,000, okay, were probably not in the disciples' mind at this point about how Jesus could take a small boy's lunch and feed so many people. I mean, at the time, that was a lesson that their eyes got big. They wow, what this man can do. They weren't thinking about that now. And that's exactly how the devil works sometimes. You're on a spiritual high. You have really been in contact with God. And then something happens and you just forget all that stuff. You're not thinking about that at all. Maybe it's the storm. It just came into your life. That's the situation. They were not looking for Jesus to come and help them at this time. All their efforts were focused on keeping the boat from sinking. Keeping it afloat. But their best efforts were not good enough. It was like they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 back all the time. Well, not only is Jesus telling us how important it is to pray and how He knows what's going on in our lives, but He's also telling us how to keep calm in our storms. Whenever you're having a storm, you can just get all frustrated and beside yourself, or you can give it to God and stay calm. The storms of life, they have a way of moving us forward and seeing what's really important about life. If we're listening, if we're looking, if we're trying. Jesus came walking to the disciples on the water, but they didn't recognize Him. And oftentimes when we are in the midst of a storm, we're so focused on the storm, we're not focused on what can I learn from this. We're asking, why, Lord? And we ought to be asking, what? What can I learn from this? Jesus saw the fear, and he calls out to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. I think the disciples had spent enough time with Jesus that they recognized his voice. Peter did anyway. Because impetuous Peter, wanting to make sure that it was Jesus, not that ghost they thought they saw, says this, Lord, if it's really you, then command that I come to you. At this point, the waves are still battering the boat. And the Lord just simply said, come. Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water. Verse 29 says, and if the text ended right there, well, this would be a great story, you know? But it doesn't. It goes on to talk about how Peter began to sink. And that's a pretty good description of what happens to us oftentimes when there's a storm. You know, we know that we want to have the Lord's help. We may even say a prayer for God to help us. And then we go back to the storm and we forget that we just prayed to God for help. And we're focused on the storm or on the problem. And so we begin to sink, just like Peter. When Peter began to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Verse 30. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and grabbed Peter. How far away they were from the boat, I don't know, but they walked together back to the boat on the water. And Peter, right then and there, started to see his faith grow, I think. And he began to realize that his faith was stronger than the storm. And his doubt began to turn into faith. Verse 31, Jesus said to him that his doubt was the cause of his lack of faith, or his faith being so small. Once Jesus and Peter were both back in the boat, the wind stopped. It doesn't tell us this time that Jesus calmed the storm. It just says it stopped. But who do you think stopped it? I don't think we have much doubt about who that was that stopped the storm. See, the lesson was over. Now it's time for worship. And it says immediately, once the wind stopped, the disciples were so astonished. They said, "You are certainly God's Son," verse 33, and they worshiped Jesus right there in the boat. That's a pretty good confession right there. You know, we think of the good confession in Matthew where Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Well, here the confession is made is, "You are certainly God's Son." Not a whole lot of difference there. Because, you see, they learned a lesson. They realized this Jesus that can take a child's lunch and feed all these people, and this Jesus who can calm a storm, we better believe in him. We can trust him. So they worshiped him and made that confession that he is certainly God's Son. I want to close with a couple of illustrations. I think Jesus, he just wants us to ask for help. When we're going through a storm, whatever it might be, we need to look to him for guidance and help. First illustration is from Sir Edmund Hillary. You may see his name on tents because of what he did. But he's one of the first guys to climb Mount Everest successfully. But he made several unsuccessful attempts before he ever succeeded. climbing Mount Everest. And after one of those unsuccessful attempts to climb the mountain, once he got back down to the base of the mountain, he turned around at that mountain and he shook his fist and he says, "Mountain, you're not going to get any taller, but I'm going to keep climbing you until I succeed." He knew that he was going to get stronger. He knew he wasn't going to give up until he had succeeded in what he did. So finally, he succeeded. Every time Hillary climbed the mountain and failed, he learned something new that helped him finally succeed in climbing the mountain. And so that day finally came where he made the attempt to climb Mount Everest, and he did not fail because of all the things he'd learned previous times he tried. Second illustration is from Dr. Wilbur Chapman. He had what he called my rule for Christian living. My rule for Christian living. He said this: "The rule that governs my life is this: anything that dims my vision of Christ, or takes away my taste for Bible study, or cramps my prayer life, or makes Christian work more difficult is wrong for me. And I must turn away from it. This simple rule may help you find a safe road for your feet as you travel along life's road too." Let me read it again. Anything that dims my vision of Christ, or takes away my taste for Bible study, or cramps my prayer life, or makes Christian work difficult is wrong for me, and I will turn away from it. He used that simple rule, making daily decisions, because he wanted to live for Christ. And so that became his rule for Christian living. You're going to find storms come in your life. That's a pretty good philosophy when they come, I think. You know, in this passage of Scripture, Peter makes two requests of Jesus. The first one is, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you walking on the water." And the second one was, "Lord, save me." You know, sometimes when we dream big, we have big plans and they don't always succeed. But I can guarantee you this, that if you do fail, God's going to be there to save you. He's going to be there to reach out his hand, just like he was for Peter, and pull him back into the boat. Isaiah 43:2 says, "When you go through deep waters and great trouble, I will be with you." And Jesus also comes to us in our storms of life when we call upon him. Because he says, "I will never forsake you, I will never leave you, not even to the end of the world." We may be small in number today, but hopefully you can weather the storms better because you came through the storm this morning to get here. And I pray that as you go home through the storm, you'll have safety as you travel. Let's stand. Let's sing our closing song. If anyone has a decision to make today, I invite you to come.